everybody. All right, so we're in my tiny little kitchen and we're gonna try to make some pizza dough. Now, I had originally wanted to make the pizza dough with my recipe that uses yeast. And I thought, yay, I've got a whole jar of yeast. The only problem was I looked at the top. Can you see that? It's been sitting in my cabinet and apparently it expired 2 years ago. So unfortunately the yeast is not, I can't use it. So that's gonna go in the garbage. But anyhow, what I did want to do though is create a recipe for you using something probably everybody does have. Yeast apparently is something that a lot of people are having trouble finding. So you can use, yeast is a leavening agent. A leavening agent rises things. So yeast is what puts the bubbles in your pizza dough. When they puff up, it makes it fluffy. So instead of yeast, what we can use is another leavening agent. And the other leavening agent is called baking powder. So I've got my ingredients here. I have a half a cup of water. We're going to do 1.5 cups of all-purpose flour, my sifter. So I'm going to sift it. And I've got a nice bowl, our measuring cup, spoon, measuring spoons. Salt, we'll use a half teaspoon of salt, 2 tablespoons of olive oil. All right, and we're going to use 1 teaspoon of baking powder. Now, I have never made pizza dough without yeast, so this will be a good time to do a recipe testing and test it out and see how it comes. So I'm going to measure everything and stir it together. All right, so just give me a second and I'll start measuring things, but I got to put the phone down. Here is our baking powder. Sorry. Baking powder, and I'm going to use 1 teaspoon of this. So we'll start off, I'm going to put the salt and baking powder in the bowl, and then I'm going to measure the flour and sift it in. So this is a 1 teaspoon measuring spoon, and I'm going to measure 1 teaspoon and make it level by, there we go, using that to make it level into the bowl. Cover that. Thank goodness I had baking powder since the yeast was bad. Then we've got our salt, and I'm going to do a half teaspoon of salt. Unfortunately, my measuring spoons are not labeled well. So here's our half teaspoon of salt. I'm going to add that to our, now our flour. We're using 1.5 cups of all-purpose flour. And I'm just going to sift it with our sifter. I can put it right in the bowl. And here's my measuring cup. I'm going to measure nice and level. And I'm going to pour that in. It's 1.5, so on the inside of my measuring cup, you see, it has markings, so I'll know where a half cup is. There we go. Okay. So this is fun. I love this little machine. You turn the crank and it starts to sift the flour. So I can add this in a bowl. And this is when you would really like another hand. 3 hands would be good at the moment, but we're sifting. All right, that's completely sifted in. Made sure there's nothing in our flour we don't want in our pizza. And now I'm going to measure in the 2 tablespoons of olive oil. And I'm going to add the water, so I'll come back in a second. All right, we have 1 tablespoon of olive oil in the flour. I'm adding the second one. Okay. And now I'm going to pour in the half cup of water. Now this is an easy dough because you just stir it together and then you knead it. With a yeast dough, you have to knead it, you let it rest, it rises, you knead it again. All right, so with this, you should be able to make the dough, let it rest in the refrigerator for maybe 10 minutes after you've stirred it together and kneaded it a little bit, and then you should be able to use it. So this is actually an even easier recipe than the yeast. So kind of good thing the yeast went bad. I can't use it because now it's forced me to learn a different recipe. The only thing is that I don't know about the outcome of it. We'll have to see. I like my pizza dough light and fluffy with air bubbles and more like a focaccia. I like Sicilian. I don't like cardboard style pizza. My mom does, but I prefer a fluffy version. So, gotta stir this all together, and while we're stirring, we're working the flour, and especially we're creating the strands of gluten. So I'm always talking about gluten in the class. Gluten is the protein in flour that when you mix it and stir it, it develops. The proteins literally become like strands, like a rubber band, okay? And the more you stir and knead it, the stronger the rubber band strands become. So that's why when you have a slice of bread, it can hold together a sandwich. It's pretty strong. When you make a cake, you do not stir together the cake batter so much. You do not want to develop the strands of protein called gluten because it'll be too tough. You want your cake light and fluffy. So that's why when we were making cakes in the classroom, I always like turn the machine off right away. You don't want to over mix it because you want your cake light and fluffy and tender. All right, a lot of bread recipes, if you've made bread before, you know you have to knead it. And that kneading action is where you're developing the strands of gluten. All right, so now that's stirred together pretty much. I'm gonna start kneading it with my hand. And I'm doing, you could do this on the counter. I'm doing it in the bowl just because it's easier for me to do it while I'm holding the camera with the other hand. But at this point, you could put a little flour on your counter, dump the stuff out, and knead it on the counter. As you see, I'm bringing it together. Now this is a fun thing to do. This is when, you can have a little fun, like playing with Play-Doh. And you want to keep kneading it and get all of the ingredients into the dough. So combine them together and keep kneading. If your dough is too dry, if you find it's too dry and it's not coming together, put in like a teaspoon of water or a tablespoon of water. Add a little bit of water at a time until it comes together. You should have a dough, okay? If it's, maybe you mismeasured the flour or you mismeasured the liquid. So if it's too dry, add some more water. If it's too wet, add more flour. All right, so if it's really sticky, and see how it's not very sticky, my hand is not full of the dough, that means it's not too sticky. If your hand is covered in dough, it means it's too sticky. So then take some flour, add it, and then keep kneading it, okay? So, but you see how my dough is nice? It's coming together. It's relatively dry. It's not wet. Okay, that's how it should look. Now I'm going to keep kneading it until it comes together, and then I'm going to put it in the refrigerator and let it rest for 10 minutes. After that 10 minutes, I can use it and roll it out. All right, so again, we had a half a cup of water, 1.5 cups of all-purpose flour, 2 tablespoons of olive oil, extra virgin I prefer. If you just have regular, that's fine, but it should be olive oil. I really don't think you can substitute canola oil or vegetable oil. It really should be olive oil. All right, then we had our baking powder, 1 teaspoon of baking powder, our salt, half a teaspoon of salt, and we mixed it together. I kneaded it for a little bit, and now I'm going to put it in the refrigerator to rest for 10 minutes. All right, I'll put the recipe on the blog so you guys will have it. I hope you'd enjoyed this, and then we can show you how to actually make the pizza next.